So thank you, Richard. As Richard was saying, I'm involved with the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities. I'm also president of the International Association for Urban Climates, which is a global organisation that represents the work of about 1,000 urban climate scientists. And as Richard also said, currently I'm working in Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 6th Assessment Report, and I'm working on Chapter 11, which is Australasia. To some extent, we've had an opportunity to incorporate elements of our work in some of that activity. What I want to do today is really provide a bit of context and perhaps something that will open up a discussion. I want to begin with what I think are a number of key messages in relation to cities, health and adaptation to climate change. And I'll go through these fairly quickly. One of the key things to recognise is that the process of urbanisation continues around the world, especially in the developing world, where the process of people moving to cities is occurring at an unprecedented rate. I mean, Australia is a highly urbanised society with more than 90% of people living in cities. Around the world, that's a much lower rate, but in the mid-2000s, for the first time, more people were living in cities than in the rural hinterland of cities. And by 2050, we're looking at close to 70% of people around the world living in cities. And so cities are an important focus, not only of economic activity, but also they're a focus for managing climate change, both in terms of mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but also of finding ways to adapt to climate to accommodate a large proportion of the global climate. So cities provide unique opportunities. Second thing to note is that urbanisation coincides with a broadening acceptance of the reality of climate change. So we clearly have evidence of the observational record. We're on track for a warming of 1.5 degrees C by 2040. So this is the historic record. This is the year-to-year variability. 2040 and 1.5 degree warming is here. So we're well on track. So the 1.5 degree report you might have heard about was released last year. This diagram is from that. 2016 and 2018, two of the warmest years on record, both tracking well above 1 degree above the 150-year record. And then we have July 2019, and this has just been released by the US Weather Service, that the month of July around the world was 1.7 degrees above the long-term average. So on a single month basis, July 2019 was above that 1.5 degree target that we're trying to stay below. And one of the reasons we're trying to stay below 1.5 degrees is that there are a whole lot of thresholds associated with those temperatures. For example, the Great Barrier Reef becomes, the damage to the reef is irreversible beyond 1.5 degrees. There are a whole lot of ecosystem responses that become irreversible above about 1.5 degrees. The other thing to note is that while average temperature is going up, probably the variable that is changing most is extremes. So the number of extreme heat days, the temperatures of those extreme heat days, extreme precipitation events and so on. And there are a good number of physical scientific reasons why that is happening, related to the whole physical system speeding up. So the third point to note, not only do we have urbanisation, and that urbanisation is taking place in a situation of climate change, but cities are hotter than their rural surroundings. So typically, and this warmth is most notable overnight. And that's important because it's those overnight temperatures that really do begin to put a lot of stress on the human body in terms of recovery from heat waves during the day. So in Melbourne, typically we have about a 4-degree urban heat island as you move from the rural hinterland into the central part of the city. And that's a very significant complication to the overall climate change issue. And it's one of the reasons why the IPCC is focusing on urban environments in the current round rather more than they have done in the past. The fourth thing to note is that cities and urban areas are highly vulnerable in the face of climate change. So this diagram here, well, you don't need to see the detail, and you certainly won't from the back, but basically it superimposes the major global cities against the areas of the globe that are at risk of climate hazard relating to sea level rise, drought or heat. And what we find is a large proportion of the global cities actually are lying in areas that are quite vulnerable. And the other thing to note is that particularly in the developed world, ageing is a key issue in urban environments, with a larger proportion of the population, of course, over the age of, say, 65. So in Australia, 1970, about 8% of the Australian population was over the age of 65. By 2050, that number will be close to 23%. Why is that important? Because an older population is much more susceptible to heat. So very young people, very old people, I'm sure you're aware of this, are susceptible to heat. Extreme heat in Australia and also around the world is responsible for more human deaths than from any other natural hazard. So more people die of extreme heat than any other natural hazard, whether it be tsunamis or hurricanes or floods or whatever. Extreme heat takes away more people every year around the world. And in Australia, it's thought that about 4,500 people have died from extreme heat since 1910, and that's thought to be about 55% of the people that are dying of some exposure to any sort of natural hazard. The fifth point to note, and this is a point of optimism, is that although highly vulnerable, cities do provide unique opportunities for climate adaptation. But those strategies we need to move on very quickly. So why do cities provide a unique opportunity? Well, first of all, as you know, we're looking at about 70% of the global population living in cities by the middle of the century. That concentration of people in one place maximises opportunities globally for both adaptation, to protect people from extreme heat, but also mitigation, so reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there are unique opportunities to address climate change in both of those important ways. And in many ways, some of the ways we address adaptation can also address mitigation, so there are often lots of co-benefits. Cities do have lower per capita greenhouse gas emissions, so there are other advantages of having people living closely together. I've talked about the co-benefits. But if we address issues around extreme heat in cities, that promises an opportunity to provide some headroom against now unavoidable climate change. So, and I'm really putting the cart before the horse here a little bit, we can show that it's possible to reduce city temperatures by as much as 1.5 or 2 degrees under extreme heat events by various physical and biophysical treatments in cities. And that 1.5 degrees is sort of commensurate with the 1.5 degrees warming by 2040. So while cities are warming on top of global, warm on top of global warming, there is an opportunity to pare back some of that heat by returning cities. One of the key ways is by returning cities to a more natural sort of environment. We'll come back to that later. So a little bit of context for our work in the CRC. The Millennium Drought was really critical. So the Millennium Drought was pretty much Australia-wide, but it was particularly concentrated in the south and east. And Melbourne and Brisbane came very close to running out of water, and it prompted, for example, the building of the Southern Hemisphere's largest desal plant outside of Melbourne, that a lot of people are critical about because it was a very energy-intensive response to issues around climate and climate change, but it was absolutely required to provide water security. But there are other ways to get water security, for example, through water-sensitive cities, which we can talk about later. We had intense heat, dust storms and fires, and concern, well, in fact, I've already talked about this, the concern about heat and health. But this last dot point, so in 2005, my research group at Monash University was asked by the Victorian Government to help in the development of a climate change adaptation plan focused on cities. And they were particularly interested in the relationship between heat and health because it was recognised that under extreme heat events people die in Melbourne. And in fact, in 2009, the Black Saturday fires took 175 lives, close to. 2 weeks earlier, and very much underreported, where almost 400 people died over a period of 3 days. So we heard nothing about the deaths associated with the heat. We heard everything about Black Saturday fires. But anyway, so there is a recognition at the government level that we really do need to address issues of heat in Victoria and around Australia. So we asked the questions, what can we do to increase the resilience of our cities in the face of climate change? So 2 areas we focused on. One was on developing improved public warnings and emergency service preparedness to save lives. And the other one was about finding solutions to make our cities cooler to save lives and protect city infrastructure from extreme heat. So I'll come back to this diagram, which essentially is a very simple one. So we spent about 6 months doing a lot of work with health data from Victoria, and from Melbourne and from other parts of Victoria. And we explored relationships between morbidity and mortality and heat. And we looked at the whole range of meteorological variables, not only temperature, we looked at humidity and so on and so forth. For the city of Melbourne, and essentially for other southern Australian cities, humidity doesn't really feature especially heavily, and you get a very strong response from temperature alone. So this is showing data on the daily mortality anomaly as temperatures vary from a mean daily temperature of 10 degrees up to a mean daily temperature of 35, 36 degrees. So by mean daily temperature, we're talking about yesterday's maximum temperature and today's, this morning's minimum temperature. And what we find for Victoria, well for Melbourne, and we've done this for all the other capital cities as well, is that there is often very little heat health response until you reach a threshold of around 28 or 30 degrees, above which you get a very strong response. So with a mean daily temperature of 30 degrees is a fairly typical hot summer's day for Australian cities. A 40-degree day followed by a 20-degree night. So under those sorts of conditions and less, we tend to get relatively little heat health response, but above that, the death rate in over 64-year-olds for Melbourne increases by about 17%. So there's nothing especially remarkable about that, and that is really the basis of Melbourne heat warning system. So the public warning goes over on television ahead of an extreme heat event uses this sort of relationship to guide those warnings. And the good thing, of course, is that the Bureau of Meteorology provides good temperature data out to about 10 days, you know, and so you can sort of pick these days coming quite a long way off. But that's interesting, but what is really, really interesting for us is the opportunity to drop temperatures by a small amount to get a big benefit in terms of heat health outcomes. So just dropping temperatures by 1 or 2 or 3 degrees has the potential to save lots of lives. And we've been able to kind of show that. So that's all very well and good, and this became the basis in 2000. It was tested in 2009 ahead of during that extreme heat event that we talked about, but it wasn't implemented until the following year. But one of the things that we found in doing that work was, of course, and this won't be a surprise to you either, that there is strong variability of heat health response across the community. And when I mean variability, I'm talking spatial variability. So if you have a look at heat-related illness and death and do a really large literature review, you'll find that effectively those variables that impact are exposure and the things that come under that, vulnerability, things that come under that, and adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity includes things like health promotion, air conditioning, and so on and so forth. That wasn't our area to work on. What we've focused on are these two areas, exposure and vulnerability. In terms of exposure, so what can we do to reduce the heat exposure on individuals? So down this side of the exposure variable, if you like, is regional climate, things like climate change, heat wave intensity and so on. Short of climate mitigation, there's not a lot we can do about that. I mean, Australia has always had a hot climate in summer and with quite extreme heat waves. So we're not going to be able to change that. But what we can do is we can moderate the exposure, particularly in urban areas, by focusing on things like urban form. And there, things like reduction of the urban heat island and reduction of urban warmth through increasing water availability, through increased green space, through providing trees and shade and so on. But also working on things like urban density, denser cities, hotter cities, and looking at the housing stock as well. So there are both internal housing things as well as external. And of course, you know, this is a big picture thing. The other thing that we can look at is vulnerability. And the work that we did, which was basically looking at other people's work, showed that there are a whole range of things that affected community heat vulnerability. And again, for people working in the health area, this won't be a surprise. Age, be the old people, very young people, people with chronic illness, socioeconomic circumstances, ethnicity, things like social isolation, all of these things impact on your vulnerability. So that promoted us to look at the spatial variability of vulnerability for Australian capital cities. So that strong spatial dimension we thought was one thing that we could do that might enable us to prioritise areas to work on, but also prioritise areas where heat health warnings and preparedness might actually be really useful in saving lives. Margaret Lufton, who was a PhD student of mine, who had a health background before she came to do a PhD as an adult student, she did her PhD on AMI, heart attack admissions on hot days, and it was able to show strong spatial variability and links to things like socioeconomics. It's not a perfect relationship, and that relationship can be tuned by including the whole range of variables. So, what happened in 2013 was that the National Centre for Climate Change Adaptation Research and the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities funded us, Margaret and myself and a few others, mainly GIS related people, to do this report, a spatial vulnerability analysis of urban populations during extreme heat events in Australian capital cities. So we looked at every Australian capital city, we looked at the heat health relationships, and we looked at the spatial response in those cities. And we used the most recent census data, which I think was 2010 or 11. And so this really does need to be updated now with more recent census data. So what we did was we identified the critical risk factors that I'll come back to in a moment. We looked at extreme heat events for each of the Australian cities, and we identified the poor heat health outcomes. And then we used some fancy statistics to select the risk factors to map heat vulnerability at the local level. So, the risk factors. There were 11, age, and this was at a postcode level. Because you've got to work at whatever level you can get the appropriate data. So we could work at the postcode level to look at the risk factors of age, number of aged care facilities in a postcode area, socioeconomic status of that postcode area, the type of dwellings in that postcode area, whether people were socially isolated, were they single person households, what proportion of houses were single person, the need for a measure of disability, population density, ethnicity. Work that had been done overseas shows that ethnicity is actually quite a strong determinant, particularly where that ethnic group has a language other than the prevailing language in that population. So obviously in Australia the prevailing language is English, so households who speak only other languages are often more vulnerable. We also mapped some biophysical variables, the urban heat island, the relative urban warmth, the land cover, the amount of vegetation on a postcode level, and, well, finally, this is not a biophysical, accessibility to emergency services. How far to the nearest hospital, how far do ambulances have to come to that postcode, etc. And so we then, for each of the Australian capital cities, including Perth, we plotted the vulnerability, and so you can see here that the vulnerability in Perth is more or less concentric, except for the wealthy inner western suburbs of Perth. Excuse me if I get the socioeconomics of Perth wrong. But you can see the reds and oranges here indicating the more vulnerable areas, and then some of these areas, particularly out to the Perth Hills and so on, are low vulnerability. Across Australia, we're actually able to show that there was quite strong association between ambulance call-outs and our maps of vulnerability. So we've done a bit more looking at this issue for Melbourne, and not only for Melbourne, these heat vulnerability maps have become highly relevant for prioritising implementation of urban design that can cool the urban landscape, but, and probably of more interest to you, the mobilisation of emergency services. So local government in Victoria does have most local government areas do have a plan for heat, and when they know that we're going to have a heatwave event, they have been using this analysis of ours to kind of identify parts of their municipality that they need to look at, address first. So we produced a report in a report called Climate Services for Health, which was a joint WMO-WHO publication in Geneva. And what we looked at was whether there was improved heat health outcomes in the 2009 heat wave relative to, 2014 heat wave relative to 2009. So 2009 was Black Saturday, forest fires, extreme heat. The highest temperature in the western suburbs of Melbourne was 48.3 or something, getting really close to that 50 degrees. By the way, all of the southern Australian capital cities are projected to have maximums that will reach into the 50s by the middle of the century. So at the moment, you know, Western Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne and Perth, pretty close too, have all had temperatures in the upper 40s. So they don't have far to go to get to 50. So we like to think that a whole range of initiatives helped with improving the heat health outcomes. So what we do, how do we actually try and identify a benefit? So, and this is no criticism of the health departments, but in Victoria, possibly like elsewhere, very reticent to give out health statistics, particularly immediately after a heat health event. So what did we do? We found that you could address the obituaries in the local newspaper, particularly in the following week. So in 2009 we had a 3-day heat wave. In 2014, you might even remember that if you watched the Australian Open in 2014, we had a 4-day heat wave with temperatures at or above 43 degrees for those 4 days. Both of these heat waves concluded on a Friday. Arguably, the 2014 heat wave was worse because it went for 1 extra day. So what we did was we counted the obituaries in the local newspapers on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of the following week. This is an indirect way of getting at these data because we couldn't get the real data. And so these are the number of obituaries in 2009 and these are the number of obituaries in 2014. These black lines represent the baseline, if you like, the number of obituaries on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the week before and the week after each of these heat events in 2009, 2014. So you can see sort of the baseline is sort of something around or just below 100 obituaries in the Age and the Herald on those days. The comparison of these two events suggests that the death rate climbed about 60% above normal in 2009 and only about 25% above what it normally would in 2014. So there appears to be about a 50% benefit or a better outcome, I should say, in 2014. And we'd like to believe that that's because of a number of things that weren't in place in 2009. So the heat forecasting system that only became operational in 2010, but also the preparedness of emergency services in Melbourne and Victoria. The hospitals were prepared, the ambulance services were prepared, the local government was prepared with cooling centres and with advice and so on and so forth. So we believe that's a positive outcome that was related to a whole range of variables. Now these vulnerability maps, although they're getting a bit dated now, they're 6 years old, probably do need to be updated if somebody wants to fund the updating. So they're on Google Maps. So we have a home page, an opening page, got all of the Australian capital cities that you can look at, and then you zoom into the city you're interested in, and then you can burrow down almost to the street level. But remembering the data are aggregated at the postcode level. So this is the report, and this is the website. If you actually just do a Google search on one word, mapping vulnerability index, that will bring it up, and you can have a look at Perth. Okay, so moving on, and I want to allow a bit of time for some discussion. So what are the key research questions about the other aspect? So we've talked about work done on developing heat health relationships and mapping vulnerability. What about what can we do to reduce temperatures to save lives? So we worked from the micro scale, the tree scale, up to the neighbourhood and the citywide scale. We did climate observations. We developed our own models and did modelling work. We did remote sensing work, and you've already heard a little bit about our database work. So the work has really focused on irrigated green infrastructure because that's the focus of the CRC for water sensitive cities. But I do point out that, that this is one very effective approach to reducing temperature, but there are others. And in fact, some of the greatest benefits you get from combinations of approaches to reducing temperatures. But just very simply, the body has a core temperature around 37 degrees, and it needs to be in climate equilibrium with the surrounds. And so there is an internal metabolism that generates heat. There is energy that comes from the environment as short and long wave radiation. If the environmental temperatures are higher than body temperatures, there will be convective gains of heat to the body. Otherwise, the body is busy trying to lose heat. And it loses heat to the environment when the body's skin temperature is higher than air temperature through convection and through radiation. And a very important way, of course, is evaporation, particularly from the lungs, but also from the skin surfaces. So this is a two-way interaction, and it's effectively an energy or heat balance. So when we're designing our cities, and when we're looking at what treatments to apply, we're interested in what we can do, particularly under extreme heat conditions, to reduce the heat loading on the body and to maximise heat drains from the body. So one of the key things to do is to minimise the radiant loading. And this is one of the reasons why simple things like shade are so absolutely critical. So if you can remove yourself from direct solar radiation and expose yourself to the sky, that's one of the most efficient ways you can cool yourself, even on a hot summer's day. On the hottest of summer days, the radiant temperature of space directly above your head, and this works better if you don't have hair, the more insulation you've got, the harder it is. Even in the middle of the hottest summer day, it's around -20, -30 degrees centigrade. Your body is probably at about 35 to 40 degrees skin surface temperature. So it's a very efficient way of losing energy. So things like moving into shade but exposing yourself to the open sky is a really good way of cooling. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. So we focused on, there are two scales here in this diagram. And each of these two scales shows some of the treatments possible using water-sensitive urban design. Things like green walls and green roofs, open water bodies, increased forest cover, tree cover, irrigation of the backyard, provision of trees on the streetscape, bioswales on the side of the road that are harvesting storm water and keeping water for trees and so on and so forth. At this micro scale, the most important thing to do is to reduce air temperature, but also to reduce radiant temperatures. Then at the citywide scale, which is anything from the neighbourhood out to the whole city, the focus is on reducing air temperature to limit heat health impacts. So we've worked at both of these scales. And we've done lots of individual studies of different components of water-sensitive cities, from the micro scale out to the what we call the local scale, which is neighbourhood to city. And we've documented the nature of the treatment. These are all published papers, and identified the cooling provided. But feels like cooling, particularly when you're looking at human thermal comfort, of about 7 to 10 degrees of cooling. So that's quite a massive impact. Moving into the shade, providing a bit of extra ventilation, providing a little bit of lower air temperature, all of these things can make you feel substantially cooler. So just to conclude, one of the last things that we've been doing in the CRC is we've been looking at the economic benefit, including health, of urban cooling. And so we identified a greenfield development in Victoria that over a period of 32 years until about 2050 is going to acquire almost 12,000 extra houses, 33,000 extra people. So it's a real suburb that is undergoing development. And we're interested in the cost benefits. So the capital and renewal costs, the ongoing maintenance costs sort of detract from the attractiveness, but then there are a whole range of relatively small but incremental benefits that accrue. You know, for example, potable system savings, wastewater system savings, amenity value, physical and mental health benefits, etc., including up here urban heat island mitigation with benefits for things like energy consumption and health and so on. And we used 4 different scenarios, and because you're not water sensitive city people, I won't bore you with the details, but basically these 4 scenarios are ranging from sort of business as usual to really heavily advanced sort of water sensitive city implementation. We developed our own model because the models available not particularly good, and it's simplified, accurate and scientifically defensible, very efficient, so it runs on a PC. So all good things, published earlier this year. And we were able to use the model under the different scenarios for examples of cool, normal summer and extreme heat summer conditions. And this shows, you know, scenario 4 minus scenario 2, with the greater blue, the greater cooling. And then we did, well, I shouldn't say we, because my research group was myself and a fellow called Kerry Nice and Stephanie Jacobs. But we combined efforts with economists who did the economic modelling using estimates of the value of a statistical life, which of course diminishes when you get over the age of about 60, morbidity, work productivity, electricity costs. Not to go into those in any detail, but these are the results. Suburb-wide benefits over 50 years using a discount rate of 5%. So I must emphasise that we took a very conservative approach. The cooling that was applied is not over 100% of the area. It is only over about 20 or 30% of the area. That's the nature of suburban development. But even so, for scenario 4, whether we're looking at the high emissions or average emissions scenarios, for this suburb, the benefits over this period of time were about $7 million. So the key messages are that you can achieve cooling and benefits from greening and integrated water management policies. The heat mitigation and the value is modest, but it is significant and incremental when you add it to the other benefits. The biggest benefit in terms of cost benefit are reduced avoidable mortality. On their own, justifying on the basis of heat mitigation, probably unlikely to justify the cost of integrated water management, but adding all the other benefits together with that does justify it. And the other thing to note is that there are other benefits of greening around carbon storage and so on and so forth. One thing we do note also is that we should replicate that study in other geographical contexts. So I have actually gone on for 40 minutes, and I'll stop there.